As my platform grows, one of the questions that I get asked the most is how to get into reading fantasy. What are the beginner series and books that can help people get into this genre? And I can totally understand that. When you look at the fantasy genre as a whole, it can be extremely daunting. There are so many series, so many names, so many standalone books. It's massive. And there are so many subgenres also that make it seem like maybe there's too many options to really know where to begin. And as someone who struggles with choice paralysis in a lot of areas of life, I feel like as a fantasy fan, this is one of my duties to try and find recommendations for people that will simplify the process of getting into reading fantasy. Now, there are already a ton of videos like this on the internet, a ton of guides about beginner fantasy, and mine is going to have some overlap with those, but what I tried to do with this video was find books from all sorts of different styles of writing and storytelling. Because fantasy is so massive as a genre, I tried to select from different subgenres also so that if you don't like one of these books, perhaps it's just not the right one for you and you can try a different one on this list that might actually grab you. And in general, that's just my main advice. If you find something and you pick it up and you read it and you don't enjoy it, don't let that put you off from fantasy, because not every fantasy book is the same. In fact, I've read some fantasy books at this point in my reading career that are so wildly different from anything else I've ever read that I genuinely don't know how to categorize them. So anyways, let's hop right into this list. The first recommendation, and this is actually a book that I always recommend to people if they're just trying to get into reading in general, is Mistborn: The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. The reason for this is that Brandon Sanderson has extremely accessible writing. There's nothing very flowery about his prose or his storytelling. He's very much to the point about things, and it's very accessible because of that. This book will also introduce you to a lot of modern fantasy trends, which is moving beyond the classic fantasy of just like dwarves and elves and goblins and whatnot. This has more of an original world with an original magic system and a plot that deviates from what you would normally expect from like an epic high fantasy series. In modern fantasy, this is a lot more common, and I feel like Mistborn is a really great entry point for people who have only ever, say, read like Lord of the Rings or seen the movies or seen things adjacent to that. This will really introduce you to a much more broader sense of what the genre can be. In essence, this is a story about a group of people who are trying to overthrow a tyrannical regime that has been controlling their empire for centuries. I don't want to say more than that for the sake of spoilers, but this is book one of a trilogy. It's the Mistborn trilogy, and I really think that if you wanted to, you could start almost anywhere with Brandon Sanderson's writing, just in general, but Mistborn is always a series that I recommend to people. My next recommendation is Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is one of the most immersive reading experiences I have ever had. Robin Hobb is a master at plugging you into the main character's point of view and making you feel what he feels. This is a very transportative experience because of that, and it's a very good way to understand how fantasy can be driven by a character's internal actions. Because while there is magic in this series, most of what this focuses on is the internal struggles of the main character and how the magic plays into that and how the fantastical elements play into their development as a character, which is something that a lot of fantasy does, but I would argue that nobody really does it better than Robin Hobb. These books are pretty depressing, be forewarned. They are pretty bleak, but that's part of the experience of reading it, is that it's not something where the hero is always going to win, where things are always going to turn out great. This focuses more on a realistic depiction of what trauma does to a person as they age. And I know that sounds really dark, but truly this is a wonderful story, and despite being pretty depressing, it's a story that is worth getting into, especially if you want to really be transported into it. So anyways, moving on from alternate world fantasy, I want to talk about an urban fantasy book, which essentially means that it takes place on Earth, but there's magic. And this is actually the series that got me back into reading at the tail end of high school. The book I'm talking about is Stormfront by Jim Butcher. This is the first book in the Dresden Files series. This series follows a wizard PI who's living in Chicago, and it starts off very pulpy. It's just him solving mysteries, but he has magic, and that's a lot of fun. The first, I think 5 or 6 books are all like that. This is a very long series. I believe we're on book 18 or something, but it develops into something that is much deeper and much bigger conflicts at stake. And the great thing about this is if you don't want to read the entire series, you could just pick up this first book and it works as a standalone book if you really want to read it that way. You could just read this series up until the point where things really start connecting and you don't miss anything. They're all work as their own standalone books up until that point. This is a very fun and funny series. There's a lot of really cool action and mysteries in here. This is just a good time, and I feel like, again, super accessible writing, and it's something that is familiar if you're not ready to jump completely into a secondary world. This would be a great place to start with getting introduced to fantasy elements within your work. This next book can work as a standalone. It's actually book one of a series, but you can just read this book on its own, and it's The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is, in essence, a fantasy heist story. It has some of the most witty banter and character work I've ever encountered. Scott Lynch's prose is very, very artful. The way he describes things is so fascinating. I had so much fun reading this book because of the way that he presents his world through words. So not only is the story itself super fun, it's a heist story, of course it's fun, and not only are the dialogues between characters super fun, just the way that things are written is in itself very playful. I think I described this book as like eating a pie. Like you have all these different layers of everything that the author is doing, and all of them have their own purpose within the story, and all of them also taste great on their own. I also love the setting in this, and that's something that's become increasingly important for me as a fantasy reader, and I think that if you've only ever experienced something like Lord of the Rings, which is very much medieval fantasy, you know, it's something that looks like medieval England or something. There's castles, there's wide-swept plains and whatnot, and that's what you're used to with fantasy. This is going to be different than that. This takes place in a very original setting that is very richly explored. There's a lot of like seafaring and nautical stuff. This is more akin to like Renaissance Italy, I would argue. This book is just a really good time. I think if you're trying to get into fantasy and you want something that's just going to be so fun on every single level, The Lies of Locke Lamora is a great place to start. And my last recommendation here, if you don't like the idea of like good versus evil in your books, you should definitely be checking out grimdark fantasy, which is where a lot of the morals between the villains and the heroes, if those even really exist within these stories, is a lot shakier. All the characters are a bit more morally gray. Their decisions and their actions might be things you don't necessarily agree with. You should definitely be checking out grimdark, and in my opinion, the best place to do that is with The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. This is a heavily character-focused book. This is all about the characters' decisions, their growth, the things that they believe in, and the way that they perceive the world. And while I think the plot is really well done and that the world is interesting in here, this is really all just set dressing for the characters to shine. I am a huge Joe Abercrombie fan. I think the way that he writes characters is incredible. They all have such distinct voices and beliefs and ways at looking at the world that every single chapter feels so defined from the one that came before it. If one of your only experiences with fantasy is like watching Game of Thrones, to me, this is the best place for you to start. But if you have almost no experience with the fantasy genre yet and you aren't aware of the tropes and the things that are super popular within fantasy, this might not be the best place to start, because a lot of what makes this special is that it's sort of picking apart the fantasy genre and turning it on its head. So a lot of the things that you would expect to happen in a fantasy book do not happen here. It subverts a lot of the tropes that you would expect. But truly, I think any one of these books would be a good place to start, and it really just depends on what your personal taste is. So like I said at the beginning of the video, if you pick up one of these and you don't enjoy it, try a different one, because all of them are so different from each other that you're gonna have a different experience with all of these, and through that, you might find what you enjoy, and then once you find that, it's a lot easier to find more books like it. Fantasy is so massive, and I promise you, if you want to get into this genre, there's gonna be something for you there. I promise you, what you're looking for is out there somewhere. It might not be in my recommendations, but it's out there somewhere, and fantasy is so important to me. I want more people to get into it, so I really think keep looking. If it's not on this list, just keep looking, see if you can find the one that's gonna work for you. But anyways, that does it for this list. I hope there's something on here that helps you at least find a recommendation if it's not one of these. And let me know if you want any more recommendations for like specific subgenres or anything, because I'm becoming a lot better read within a lot of these subcategories of fantasy, fantasy. And I feel like the more niche you look, the harder it is to find recommendations. So if you have something like that that you want, I can maybe help out. But anyways, until next time, guys, I hope you're happy and healthy. I hope you're doing well, and I will see you then. Bye-bye. See ya. Ciao. Adios. Later. Bye.